This webinar is geared towards people who are getting started in QuickBooks Online and want to learn the basics of how to set up a new company file and just how to, in general, enter transactions, simple transactions, knowing which transactions to enter in different scenarios. Now, number one, we're going to talk about connecting our bank accounts to reduce data entry. This allows us to download transactions directly from the bank and directly from credit cards. And it dramatically reduces the amount of time that you spend in entering that information. We'll also talk about just how to get around in QuickBooks Online. So what all the different buttons do, what all the different menus are there for, just how to move from one place to another and get to where you want to get to. We'll also talk about lists, what those are, how to use them, and how to use them to help you organize your data. Because lists are something that help you enter transactions much more quickly, and it also helps you organize data later on whenever you look at your reports. We'll also talk about recording expenses and sales. So if you want to learn the basics of when to enter one sales transaction versus another one, or when to enter one certain type of expense transaction or another one, this is a great class because we're going to cover the basics of those things. Now, all of the things that we cover here are also covered in more depth in other classes. Like we have an entire class just devoted to entering expense type transactions and bills and checks and all that. So we have one entire class for just the expense type transactions. We also have one entire class for just the income type transactions. So you're going to get a basic overview in this class, but if you want to get that more in-depth overview, I highly recommend attending those other classes as well. So we're also here to answer your questions. So if at any time you have any questions, feel free to type them in, click on send, and that'll send them on over to us so we can help you out with. Now, the very first thing I want to do is talk about online banking, because this is one of the most important features of QuickBooks Online. It's one of the best ways for you to enter transactions more quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my QuickBooks Online company here. And to sign up for online banking, all you have to do is click on Connect Accounts right here at the bottom of the bank accounts area, or click the banking link over on the left-hand side. And whenever you do so, you're going to be brought into a page where you can select your bank or your credit card company from a list of popular banks, and you can also type in the name of it right here. You'll be asked to enter the username and password that you use at your bank's website or your credit card's website. And basically, it's going to actually take you to your bank or credit card's website, because you're not actually going to be entering any of this information into QuickBooks. QuickBooks does not store your username. It doesn't store your password or any sensitive information like that. What's going to happen is it's going to take you to a page maintained by your bank or by your credit card company. So QuickBooks never has that information to begin with. Once you sign into that account, QuickBooks Online is going to automatically download the last 90 days worth of transactions into QuickBooks Online. Now, those transactions go into the banking center, and I often like to refer to the banking center as a kind of a waiting room, because while transactions are in the banking center, they're not actually doing anything to your bookkeeping. So while they're all here, all these transactions that we see down here at the bottom, they don't count towards anything. So we still have to go through here. We still have to add some details, match them up with existing transactions. We still have to work with them in order to make them count. Now, up here at the top of the banking center, we see various boxes, and you'll see one box for every account that is connected to QuickBooks Online. So any of your banks, any of your credit card accounts, they'll all appear as their own box. And we're going to see a couple of numbers up here. The very first one is the balance according to the latest information from the bank. This is how much money the bank thinks we have, or in the case of a credit card, how much money the credit card thinks we owe. Now, we also have a number immediately beneath it, which is the in QuickBooks balance. And that number is often different. And that's something that often freaks people out a little bit, because they see these two numbers being different and they think, shouldn't they be the same? Shouldn't QuickBooks and the bank have the exact same balance? Not necessarily, because it could be that there are just some transactions that the bank knows about, but QuickBooks doesn't know about yet. Like all of these transactions that we've downloaded right here, all these transactions, they're not counting towards our in QuickBooks balance. Even though they are in QuickBooks technically, we haven't added them yet, so they're not contributing to that balance yet. Also, It could be that we've written some checks out of QuickBooks, or we've written some checks from our checkbook and we put those into QuickBooks. Well, QuickBooks knows about those checks, but the bank doesn't know about those checks until they get cashed. So sometimes there's a little bit of lag, either between the bank and QuickBooks or QuickBooks and the bank, for those numbers to catch up. And the result of that is that they're generally not really going to match up. And in fact, the larger a business gets, the bigger this difference will often be. Now, there's also a number right here, which is the number of transactions in our waiting room. So these are the ones that are waiting for our approval. So we've got 16 transactions to work through right here. Now, what I like to do is collapse this topmost portion. That way I have more screen real estate to work through. So I'm going to go ahead and click this up arrow, and that collapses all of my selections. But I can still switch between different accounts by clicking this drop down arrow right here, and we'll see all the different accounts available. Now, whenever you download a transaction, QuickBooks gets several pieces of information from the bank or from the credit card company. First, it gets the date of the transaction. So this is when it cleared the bank. It also gets whether or not you spent money or whether you received money with that transaction. There's also something called the bank detail. And the bank detail is normally going to be who you paid or who you received the money from. And QuickBooks gets that information from the bank. Now, QuickBooks Online uses that bank detail information to try to make an assumption about why you spent this money or why you received this money. Like here, for instance, we have Cheesecake Factory transactions, several of them. Whenever I click on a Cheesecake Factory transaction, QuickBooks Online assumes that this is meals and entertainment because it knows that that's what most people enter this as across all of QuickBooks Online. So it takes that data, it understands why people spend money at the Cheesecake Factory. And so it automatically puts in meals and entertainment. But if it's something different or if QuickBooks Online didn't get it right, you can click your drop-down menu right here, and you can choose a different account from the list. So you can choose a different expense account, income account, asset account, depending upon what it is that you bought. Now, it got it right for us with meals and entertainment, so we don't have to change that. But we can still put a payee in. Like right here, if I click in the payee box, I can choose from my list of vendors if I already have the Cheesecake Factory on there, or in a lot of cases, people will not want to record each individual restaurant or each individual convenience store or each individual Home Depot. So instead, they'll just put in a category of vendor. So right here, for instance, I could just type in restaurant. And that way, anytime we have any transactions with restaurants, I would just use that as my vendor instead of cluttering up my vendor list, which can absolutely happen. So here, I'll go ahead and click on Add Restaurant. And then that allows me to set that catch-all vendor up as a vendor. I'll click on Save. And right here, we can see pretty much immediately that QuickBooks Online has applied that same payee to all of the Cheesecake Factory transactions. And this is one of the things that QBO tries to do. It tries to learn about why you enter transactions and who you have transactions with. So it's trying to make your job easier as time goes by. And it's going to make it even easier because as we can see, meals and entertainment is selected for all these transactions. And as I click Add, all of those transactions, expense account now turns green. So we are able to see that not only does QuickBooks Online know that this is meals and entertainment, but this transaction is now something called recognized. Recognized transactions are the ones that are far easier for you to add because what you can do is scroll up here to the top, and then right here, there is a little button that says recognized with 3 in parentheses. If we click that button, it's only going to show us the recognized transactions. So these are just transactions that have been added in terms of, you've added that vendor before, you've had transactions with that vendor before, and QuickBooks Online understands why you spend your money at these places. So it's going to display all of those, and you can add them really quickly by clicking this top left checkbox, and then choosing batch actions except selected. That way you can add transactions in a batch instead of one by one by one. And this dramatically reduces the amount of time that you have to spend in data entry. And it just gets better and better and better the longer you use QuickBooks Online, because QuickBooks Online is going to start understanding more and more of your vendors, more and more of your customers. and it applies those same rules over and over and over again. So that's the process for adding new transactions, especially expenses, into QuickBooks Online. Now, throughout the webinar, we're going to come back here and talk about other situations in which we might need to deal with the banking center, because it could also be that you've downloaded a transaction that you've already entered. And so dealing with those transactions that you've already entered can be kind of tricky. And we're going to talk about that as the webinar progresses. So we're not finished with the banking center, but we are finished for adding these new transactions right now. The next thing I want to talk to you about is just how to get around in QuickBooks Online and how to know which different menus to go to, which different buttons to click, things like that. So first of all, everything in QuickBooks Online can be gotten to by one of three different menus right here on the dashboard. The first menu is the nav bar over here on the left-hand side. The nav bar allows us to access historical information. So if we want to see information about our sales that we've already entered, we can click on sales and it takes us to the sales window. There's also a place right here where we can see our customers and also the products and services that we sell. And this is all information about things that have already happened. We also have expenses. So from here, if I click on expenses, I'm taken to a list of all of my expenses from my company. And I can also click on vendors to see a list of the people that I paid. In general, customers are people that buy things from you, and vendors are people that you buy things from, or people that you pay for the services that they provide for you. There's also workers right here. This is where you're able to see your list of employees if you're using payroll through QuickBooks. And then there's also reports. So we're able to see information about our company right here in the Report Center. You can run all of your reports from here, and you can collate information about your company's history. Again, going back to that idea that this nav bar is for historical information, looking up information that's already been entered. There's also taxes. This is a record of information for the sales taxes that you've collected for your from your customers. And if you're using payroll, you'll also see payroll taxes. Then we also have accounting. This is where you see your chart of accounts. And this is what you use to categorize all those transactions. So those expense accounts that we were looking at earlier, they come from the chart of accounts. And the chart of accounts is essentially the hub of your accounting system. And we actually have an entire class just devoted to the chart of accounts, which I highly recommend you attend if you are at all interested in accounting and how the balance sheet is built, how the profit and loss statement is built, how transactions go into QuickBooks and affect these various different accounts and statements. So we've got our chart of accounts here, and we've also got a place right here where we can invite our accountant to come into our company file and do the things that they need to do. There's also apps that we can look at if you want to shop around and see if there are any apps that would add some usability to QuickBooks Online for your company. So that's the nav bar over on the left-hand side of the screen. There's also the Create menu. Now, the Create menu is where you go if you want to enter a new transaction. So by clicking on the plus menu, right here, I can see a listing of all the different types of transactions that I can manually enter into QuickBooks, and they're organized by who you do business with. So right here, we're able to see all the transactions for customers. We've got all of our expense transactions underneath vendors, payroll transactions, and then other. So we're able to see all of those right there from our Create menu. There's also the gear icon. This is the third of those three menus. And the gear icon is where you go if you want to access something that's not really accessed very often, but is still very important in terms of your overall usage of QuickBooks Online. From this gear icon, you'll budgets, for instance. And budgets are things that you'll probably do once a year or whenever you get a new customer. So it's not really something you need to access very often. There's also reconciliations. Reconciliations are something you do once a month whenever you get those bank and those credit card statements. And then there's also account and settings. Account and settings might be something that you only access one time whenever you initially set up your company. And you're able to set up all of your account and settings, make sure that you've got all that laid out, and then you might never need to go back to it ever again. I call this menu the set and the forget menu because it's something that you go to, you set it up, and you probably never have to go back to it after that. Now, there is a fourth menu. I wasn't lying. Everything in QuickBooks Online can be accessed through those three menus. But there's one additional menu that I always point out because it's very handy, and that's the magnifying glass. This is where we go if we want to look at any of the past 10 transactions that we've recently entered. So for instance, all those restaurant transactions that we can see right here, they are all listed under the recent transactions. So you're always going to see the most recent 10. And you can also search for transactions right here in the search for customers, vendors, and transactions field. Now, that's the basic menu structure of QuickBooks Online, but there's also the individual buttons and user interface elements that you'll see on transactions. So let's take a look at that too. I'm going to go ahead and click on my Create menu here, and we're going to open up two different types of transactions. Very different transactions, these two, but it's worth looking at both of them and seeing their differences and their similarities. So the first transaction I want to open is something called an invoice. An invoice is created if you want to email an invoice to a customer or print out an invoice to a customer, telling them how much money they owe you, and also listing all the products and services that you're charging them for. So this is basically a sale. So let's go ahead and open up our invoice just so we can take a look at what it looks like. The invoice comes down, it takes up the entire screen, and up here at the top left, we enter the customer that we're going to send the invoice to. Now this is who we are charging for this invoice. Then down here in the middle, we're going to see a whole bunch of info that is going to vary by business to business because there are a lot of things that you can turn on and off about invoices to add additional information. But there's also something on here that will always be on invoices, which is the date range of the invoice. Right here we see the terms. That's how many days the customer has to pay. And then there's also the invoice date. That's the day that we're issuing the invoice, followed by the due date. So that's when the customer needs to pay us, otherwise they'll be overdue. So basically this is the date information, so when the transaction took place. Then going down a little bit further, there's also products and services. This is where you enter what it is that the customer is buying or what it is that you're charging the customer for. And then up at the top right, you'll see a total amount. This is how much you're charging the customer. So the invoice can be broken down into four major parts. First, there's who is involved with the transaction. Then there is when the transaction took place. Down at the bottom, there is what the transaction is for. And then up here at the top right, you see how much the transaction is for. So it's who, when, what, how much. Those are the questions that the invoice answers. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this. And we're going to move over to a different type of transaction, totally different type of transaction, because this one is one in which we are spending money. So right here underneath vendors, I'm going to click on check. And a check is a situation where we are writing a physical check to a vendor. We're going to be paying somebody, so very different from an invoice. Whenever I open up the check, again, it's going to take up the entire screen, comes down from the top. And as you can tell, almost immediately, this is a very similar looking transaction. And that's on purpose. Intuit is designing these transactions to make it so that you don't have to relearn every time you deal with a new type of transaction. Up here at the top left, you have who you paid. Then in the middle, you have when you paid them. Down here at the bottom, you have what you paid them for. Same exact layout. And then up at the top right, there's also the how much you paid them. So even though these are very different types of transactions, they still have the same basic layout, the same basic data, and you don't have to relearn them over and over again every single time you look at a new transaction. Now that's the basics of how to use things in QuickBooks Online's browser version. But there is a version of QuickBooks Online available for your mobile devices. So phones, tablets, things like that. And you can get this for free. All you have to do is search the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store for QuickBooks Online. Generally, it's going to be the very first one that you see. And you'll know that it's the right one because it'll say QuickBooks Online Accounting, Invoices, and Expenses. I think that's the full name. If you see QuickBooks Online Self-Employed, that is not the right one. You don't want the self-employed one. You want the accounting one. Now, this app looks largely the same as the browser version. It still has a plus button, Still has a dashboard that you open up into it, still has customers, still has vendors, all that same stuff. But they're in slightly different places. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you a couple of different things that you can do within the app. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the iOS version of the app. And the Android version is largely the same. The only difference is that the plus at the top right corner of them, and in the iOS version, it's at the bottom. That's the only difference between the two. They have some cosmetic differences, but besides that, they still work the same way. So what we're going to do is I'm going to explain the process of entering an expense first. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about recording a sale as well. So let's see that. This first one is going to be about expenses. And to enter a new transaction, you record them with the plus button down at the bottom of the screen, just like you do with the browser app, and just select the type of transaction you want to enter. We're going to enter a transaction for $250 worth of job materials. So we just type in 250. Then we're going to choose between credit, check, or other for the type of expense that we had. We'll choose other because we're going to use a debit card. Then we'll just choose the bank account that was affiliated with that debit card. Then in the middle, right there, you can see February 22nd, 2018. You can change the date, just press on it with your finger, and you can choose between different dates right here. Then there's also a section for who we paid. So right here, we can enter that we paid Joaquin's Hardware Emporium, one of our vendors for job materials. So we'll select them from our list of vendors. And once they're selected, we then have to answer what kind of expense is this? And that question tells QuickBooks why we spent the money, what we were trying to buy. And so these different accounts come from our chart of accounts. We've got all of our expense accounts, things like that. You can also indicate who this transaction was for. So if you want to do some job costing, or if you want to make it billable, you can press on that option, and you'll see a list of your customers as well. Then there's also a billable option down there at the very bottom. Now, scrolling down to the very bottom of the screen, there's also a section for split. So if you want to enter multiple expense accounts, liability accounts, asset accounts, you can do that there. There's also a section for reference number and memo for you to keep additional details. Now, scrolling back up at the top, there is a camera up at the top left. If I press on that, it's going to open up the camera for my phone, and then you can take a picture of the receipt, and that picture is going to be uploaded immediately as soon as you click on Save for this transaction. It uploads it to your company file. And what's great about that is that whenever anybody accesses that expense later on, they can download the receipt. So if it's up in the cloud, it's available to anybody who has access to the company file. So big advantage there. You can just take pictures of your receipts really fast and automatically put them into QuickBooks like that. Now, in addition to recording expenses, you can also record sales. So what I'm going to do is also play one to show you how basic sales transactions are entered as well. And so let's do that now too. Now with sales transactions, we again have the same options. Down towards the bottom, you press on plus, just like you do in the browser version, anytime you want to create a new transaction. And we're going to choose invoice, to invoice a client. So up at the top, we'll choose the customer, choose them from a list of our customers. And then we've got the date, terms, and the due date, all available for us right there. So right here, if I were to choose, say, different terms, that would be me changing how many days the customer has to pay on that particular invoice as we create it. In the middle, you're able to see the add line item. That's where you tell QuickBooks about what it is that you're charging your customers. And these different products and services come from your products and services list, which we'll come to here in a minute. It also brings in their rates, their default rates, and you can change the quantity, you can change the rate as you record these transactions. Just change the quantity, change the rate. Press on add up at the top right, and that brings the transaction in. You can also enter your own description, which will be sent off to the customer as well, along with the invoice. Now we're going to go ahead and click on add to press that in, and there we go. There's our design. It's going to be on the invoice. You can press on it again to change any details. You can also press on add line item to add more things onto the invoice. Scrolling down to the bottom, there is a section where we can enter additional details like a message to the customer and also a memo. So With this invoice, what we're able to do is save this on our app, and it keeps track of the process of the invoice. Right now, it knows that it hasn't been sent yet. So it allows us to send the invoice directly from our phones. And so you can change the email address, the subject, the body, and you can also scroll down to see a preview of what the customer will see on their invoice. Now, once I press on send, that sends out the invoice, and it keeps track of where you are in the process of that invoice, sent, and then receiving a payment, and then ultimately also depositing that payment into the bank. So these apps are, or this mobile app is tremendously useful, both for entering sales, entering expenses, especially if you're going to be out of the office. But even for those of you who are not going to be leaving the office, it still has things that you can do within it to help to reduce the amount of work that you're doing. So next, I want to talk to you about lists. And these are the people and things that we do business with, and it helps us to much more quickly enter information on transactions. Now, what I'm going to do is click on my Create menu right here and then open up an invoice. And up at the top left, I'm going to choose a customer from that list of customers. I'm going to choose Amy's Bird Sanctuary. Notice that QuickBooks Online automatically enters the email address and also the billing and shipping address for that customer. So I don't have to type that in. And it does that because I've already entered Amy's Bird Sanctuary as a customer. Also, down here towards the bottom with the products and services area, if I click the drop-down arrow for these products and services, I can choose from a list of them. So right here, if I press on Design, it brings in a default description of the design as well as a rate for the design. And all of this information is coming from lists. The big benefit of lists is that you're able to set up information about these things ahead of time. That way, whenever you're entering transactions for them, it automatically pulls in that information onto the transactions. So if I click on sales, for instance, and then customers, this is a listing of my customers that I've set up. I can track how much money they currently owe me right here with the open balances. We can also see their phone numbers, their email addresses, any of that information. And whenever we go to create transactions for them, it'll automatically pull that information in onto the invoices. All you have to do is click on New Customer up here at the top right, and then fill in their information, and you'll be able to plug that information in automatically with all those sales transactions. The same information is also available for all of your vendors. So clicking on Expenses and then Vendors up here at the top, you can then click on New Vendor, and this gives you a field where you can type in information about the people that you buy things from. The other advantage to this is that once you've entered a customer, once you've entered a vendor, once you've entered some transactions with them, you can potentially run reports that tell you how much you've spent with those vendors, how much money you've made with those customers. And QuickBooks Online will collate that information onto your reports. There's also a list called the Chart of Accounts. And this is the hub of your accounting. This is a listing of all the accounts that you can use when categorizing transactions. And there is also a products and services list. This is where QuickBooks Online keeps track of all the things that you sell. So that design that we saw earlier on the invoice, it's got a listing right here on the products and services list. Here's design right there. And it's got the sales description. It's also got the sales price. You're able to set these up brand new by clicking on New. You can also edit them. And another thing that these are very important, that's very important about these, is this selection right here, which is the income account. So whenever we make sales in design, QuickBooks Online is going to use this product or service entry to know where to put that income on our profit and loss statement. So if we sold $500 worth of design on our invoices, because design income is listed as the income account, QuickBooks Online knows to increase that income account on our profit and loss statement by the same amount. So that's where QuickBooks Online understands how to work with those things that you sell and change your reports accordingly. So all of these lists are very important in terms of keeping track of your information. So entering new entries, pretty simple, just click on the New button, but you can also edit them by clicking on them and then choosing Edit up there at the top right. So if anybody changes an address or if you need to change any other information about them, you can. There's also an option over here on the right-hand side to click the drop-down arrow and then choose to make them inactive. That goes for customers, that goes for vendors, accounts on the chart of accounts, products and services that you sell. You'll always have that option to make them inactive, or potentially if it's the chart of accounts, it'll say delete. So you can manipulate these different lists, you can work with them, you can tidy them up, make sure that they don't get too long, because you don't want to have just thousands and thousands of customers and vendors to work with whenever you're entering those transactions. One thing that's important to note is that if you delete something or make it inactive, all the transactions that were with that customer or with that vendor will still be in QuickBooks. So those don't go away. It's just that it'll be deactivated from that list. So you won't see it later on whenever you click on the customer's drop-down arrow and choose it from the list. So the last thing I want to talk to you about are the basics of transactions. And we've already talked a little bit about transactions because we talked about downloading them from the bank. But I want to talk to you a little bit about workflows and when to enter particular transactions manually. Now, when it comes to expenses, there are two major categories of expenses. The ones over here on the left are all expenses except for checks. So EFT transactions, debit cards, credit cards, bank charges, wire transfers, all those things, anything that's not a physical check can be downloaded into QuickBooks Online through the Banking Center. So basically, you'll just sign up for online banking, download those transactions, and then you click Add. Once you click Add, that brings them into QuickBooks and you're done. But you do need to enter transactions manually if it's a check, and by check I mean a physical check, or if it's a bill, which means that it's something that you owe to somebody and you're going to pay them later on. Now, we don't cover bills in this class, but we do in the Track Your Expenses class. So if you're interested in learning about bills and accounts payable and how to record all of that, I highly recommend signing up for that class as well. But I will show you how to enter a check, because we've already talked about how to enter those debit card charges, credit card charges, things like that through the Banking Center. Let's talk about checks really quick. So with a check, the first thing we want to do is go up here to the Create menu, and then underneath the Vendors, choose Check. And the check that we're going to enter right now is actually a historical check. We wrote it a couple of weeks ago. Actually, we wrote it a couple of last month. And so right here for the payee, I'm going to put in who we wrote the check out to, which is the advertising. Then we've got the bank account that we used to write the check. And then right here, we're going to put in the payment date. So we're going to say we wrote this check on 05/03/2018. Now, this was a handwritten check for the check number. I'll record this as check number 100. And then down here in the account area, I'll tell QuickBooks what it is I spent money on for this check. And we spent some money on advertising, because Lee Advertising designed our summer brochure. Then in the amount field, we'll enter $135.31. That's how much we paid Lee Advertising. Now, you may or may not see some other fields over here like billable, markup percentage, and customer. The reason why I see them is because I have some settings turned on in my Gear Accountant Settings section, in which I have elected to track my expenses for individual customers and jobs, and also I chose to potentially make them billable. What that means is that if you want to track expenses in terms of job costing, you need to have this turned on. It allows you to choose a customer from the list. Also, you can choose billable if you want to bill that customer for that expense later on. So that's why that's there. But we're not going to do that for this transaction. This is just us spending $135.31 on advertising. That's just for us. And then I'm going to go ahead and save and close on this. Now, that transaction's been entered. It's going to lower our profit and loss statement's net income by the amount of the check. And you may be wondering, what about when that check gets cashed? Aren't we going to download that, and then it's going to have two of those checks, the one that I just entered and also the one that we downloaded? Let's go check it out. I'm going to go ahead and click on Banking and then scroll down a bit. And it looks like something new has happened. Right here we see something called One Record Found. What's up with that? Well, this transaction was downloaded on 5/5/2018, and it was for $135. Now, QuickBooks Online, whenever it downloads a transaction from the bank, it looks through your history of transactions to see whether or not you've already entered it. And in this case, we had, because naturally you just saw me enter it, right? So whenever I click on this transaction, QBO is going to tell me the transaction that it found that we've already entered. It sees that we already entered check number 100. We entered it with the date of 5/3/2018 for $135.31. Now, what this process allows me to do is click match. And matching means that the transaction I entered manually and the transaction that I downloaded from the bank are going to be matched together. That means that they will not be counted twice. So once I click on match, it clears that transaction from the list, and I don't have to be worried about it being counted twice. That's why matching is so important. Now, the most important thing about matching is making sure that the amounts are the same. That's the thing that QuickBooks Online looks for more than anything else. It wants the amounts to be the same. And if it's even off by a cent, it's going to throw off that automatic detection, so it's not going to be able to detect it automatically. If there's a transaction that you know you've entered, but for whatever reason QuickBooks Online isn't finding it and isn't trying to match it up, you can also click on Find a Match, and it'll bring up a listing of possible transactions that you can force a match with in QuickBooks Online. Now that's how to record checks, and with expenses, you're going to download those transactions directly into the banking center. That's the easiest way. Now let's talk a little bit about sales transactions. Now there are two different workflows to talk about with sales transactions. The first one over on the left-hand side is the customer pays at the time of the sale. Now, if your customer is going to pay you immediately, so basically they walk up to the counter, you tell them how much they owe for whatever it is they're trying to buy, and they pay you right there. If that's the case, the first thing you enter is a sales receipt. And the sales receipt tells QuickBooks Online about that sale. It also potentially tells it where the money went to. If the money goes into the checking account, you don't have to do this second part, which is making the deposit. But if you are going to be depositing that sale later on with other customer sales, then you'll need to use what's called undeposited funds. And it's going to have to require you to enter a second transaction after this one. And we'll walk through that from beginning to end here in a little bit. There's also a workflow over on the right. Customer has X days to pay. So if you give your customers a couple of days or weeks or months to pay you on the things that you send them off to, you're going to have to record this as an invoice. And then separately, once they pay you, it's going to be recorded as a payment and then finally as a bank deposit as well. Now let's walk through these so you can see the process for each one of these different types of situations. First of all, we're going to talk about invoices. So what I'm going to do is go over here to my customers list. And I have a customer named Dylan Solfrank, and I'm going to send Dylan a invoice. So I'll select the Create menu, then Invoice. This invoice is also a historical transaction. For the customer, I'll put in Dylan Solfrank. It brings in his email address, his billing address automatically. And this transaction occurred on 05/01/2018. And then down here in the product and services area, I will enter what it is that Dylan bought, which is a rock fountain. Now, I didn't charge him $275. This is a slightly different costing rock fountain. It's for $227. So we'll type that in instead. Now, with this invoice, I can save and send it. That'll save an email off the invoice to my customer. There's also an option right here for printing the invoice out with print later. But we're just going to save and send. This emails out the invoice with the subject and body chosen by you right over here. And then over here on the right-hand side, you're able to see what the customer will eventually see once they open up their inbox and open it up. We'll send and close. That emails out the invoice. Now, scrolling down a bit, I can see right here, Dylan Solfrank owes me $227. So QBO keeps track of the amount of money that your customers owe you. Now, of course, we're going to go back to our normal business, click on the dashboard, do other things. Eventually, our customer pays us. It could be a couple of days later. In fact, in this case, it is a couple of days later. So whenever they eventually pay us, what we'll do is click on the Create menu up here at the top right, and then underneath Customers, choose Receive Payment. The very first thing we have to do for the Receive Payment screen is choose their name from a list, Dylan Solfrank. We're going to go ahead and choose them from the list right there. And then we're going to see a listing of all the different invoices that we have for that customer. If you have multiple, you can select multiple or just one. We only have one for Dylan Solfrank. QBO assumes that the customer wants to pay the entire amount, but you can change that in this field. So if it's a partial payment, you can plug in the number that they're actually paying, and QBO will keep track of the amount that they owe. Now, in the middle of the screen, we see something very important, and that's the payment method and also the deposit to field. This is where the money is going and also how it is that the customer is paying us. Now, you might not think that this is that important of a question in terms of the deposit to, so where the money is going, because of course it's going into our bank account, right? That's probably where most of the payments are going to go. But the problem is that this window isn't just asking us where is the money going to go. It's asking us where is the money going right now, like right now. So let's think of a situation. First, we have a situation where we could be taking this money from our customer immediately and then immediately going down to the bank and depositing it by itself. In that situation, choosing checking here makes a lot of sense because we are going to take that check or however it is they're paying us, take it down to the bank account right away. But in a lot of cases, businesses don't take the money and then immediately put it into the bank account. In a lot of cases, companies take the money and they put it into a drawer, or they put it into a cash register, or they're using a merchant services company that takes the money and then deposits the money with other customer payments at the end of the day. If any of those cases are what's really happening, we're not going to use the checking account at all. We're going to use something called undeposited funds. And undeposited funds is a catch-all term for all of the money that customers have given you, but you haven't put into your bank yet. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying about how this window, it wants to know where the money is going right now. It doesn't care about where it's going later on. It doesn't care. It wants to know where the money is going right now. And if the money right now is going into the bank account, great, choose the bank account. If the money right now is being put into some other place, any other place, and it's going to be put into the bank account later, you're going to use undeposited funds. Because using undeposited funds allows you to group those customer payments together later on onto deposits. So if you make deposits with 5 or 6 or 10 or 100 different customer payments, you'll need to use this. That's what we're going to do right here. Now, if you actually are putting in a bank account, you can enter a bank account that's record this transaction and then you're done. You don't have to record anything after this. But for us, we're going to use undeposited funds. And then for the payment method, we'll go ahead and choose check. We're going to say that Dylan Solfrank is going to write us a check number 123. And then I am going to record this transaction. So we've recorded the payment. And I want to see if Dylan Solfrank owes us any money. Clicking on sales, scrolling down a little bit, here we can see what Dylan Solfrank's balance has been paid off. Perfect. We also have another customer down here, which is John Smith. Now, we'll go with Kate Whelan. We have a customer named Kate Whelan. Kate Whelan is going to come into our office and buy something from us in our office. And so whenever the people come into our office, they pay us right away. We don't give them an invoice. They just buy the thing that they're coming in to buy. So what I'll do is click on my create menu. And because they're paying me right away, I'm going to use a sales receipt. Now, this customer, Kate Whelan, we don't have to enter the customer's name in the customer field. This is actually optional on a sales receipt. And if you're running a restaurant, if you're running a retail location, chances are you don't know the name of your customer. And that's okay. You don't have to record one. So, but for us, Kate's a regular customer, so we want to record her name. It brings in the billing address, brings in the email address, all that information. And we're also going to record the date that this transaction took place, which is going to be on 05/05/2018. And then down here in the products and services area, we'll enter whatever it is that Kate Whelan is buying. And she's going to buy some rocks. Not a rock fountain, just some rocks. And it's going to be $400 worth of rocks. A lot of rocks. Maybe she's making some rock fountains. Here in the middle, we are again going to enter where it is we're putting this money. And again, if the money is going directly into a bank account, you can choose the bank account right here. But for a lot of you, you are taking this money and then you're going to deposit it at the bank later on, or your merchant services company is going to deposit it at the bank later on. So because of that, I'm going to choose undeposited funds. We're going to say that Kate Whelan is going to pay us in, we'll just say cash, $400 worth of cash. We're not going to turn that away. And then I'm going to save and close on this as well. So that transaction, that sales receipt, does not affect Kate Whelan's balance at all because she owes us money and then she pays us immediately. So she never carries a balance with that transaction. Now, we've recorded two sales. One is an invoice received payment, one as a sales receipt. Now it comes time to us to make the bank deposit. Now, if the money went directly into the bank account in any one of those transactions, we do not have to do this step. This step is only used if you use undeposited funds. Now, on my chart of accounts, going over to accounting, this is my chart of accounts. If I scroll down to the undeposited funds area, here I can see all the money that customers have paid us that we haven't put into the bank yet. So if I want to record a sale, I'll record it normally, and then whenever I put in the deposit to, my undeposited funds is going to go up with all the money that we put in there. And we need to make a separate bank deposit that's going to link those customer payments together. The way you do that is by clicking on the Create menu, and then underneath Other, choose Bank Deposit. Now, the bank deposit screen first asks you where you're going to be depositing the money to. We're going to deposit it into checking. Then here in the middle, we see all of the different payments that we've received from our customers that are in undeposited funds. Notice that this balance right here is the same balance as we saw earlier with undeposited funds. Now, what I'm going to do right here is select the Kate Whelan transaction and also the Dylan Silfrank transaction and make sure that I've got the date right as well. And I'm going to go ahead and change this over to 5/6/2018. Now, this transaction is a deposit to our bank account for $627. That allows me to group the $227 transaction and also the $400 transaction together, making a single deposit that is made up of both of those payments. This is incredibly important because going back to what I was talking about earlier with matching, you have to have transactions that you enter manually into QuickBooks and also the transactions that you download into QuickBooks from your banking center have the same amounts. If they don't, you're not going to be able to match them, which is why we use undeposited funds. Because if we had deposited those two sales transactions by themselves into the bank account, we would not be able to download the banking transaction for $627 and match the transaction for $400 and $227 independently. So this allows us to create those batch deposits. Now, what I'm going to do right now is save and close this, and this is going to take $627 out of the undeposited funds balance, and we can see that happen right there. Undeposited funds went down, and the checking account went up because we put that money into the checking account. And that's the process for sales. Now, just to check up on the banking center, I go over here and let's take a look at our transactions. Now, the deposit that we entered earlier, let's see right here. We're going to make sure that it gets matched up. And looking over my list of transactions here, we can see the deposit for 5/6/2018 for $627. Whenever I click on it, here's the deposit that I just entered earlier. So the transaction that I entered earlier is now being matched against the downloaded version of the transaction. That ensures that they're going to match up, and we can just click on match to make sure that they don't get counted twice. So incredibly important process to use undeposited funds in those cases where you're grouping customer payments together. And that brings us to close to the end of the class. So I still have a couple of things that I want to wrap up really quick. First of all, I want to make sure that you all know what to do after this class is over, because of course there's more to learn about QuickBooks than just this one class. This is the Get Started class. We're just getting started. If you want to move on into more in-depth classes, I want you to know where to go. And I also want you to know that there is a YouTube channel that you can access that has tons of great recordings for all these things.